I'm Denny Karst. I'm introducing tonight's speaker. Just one housekeeping announcement. This is sort of like backcountry woods and so forth camping. We should leave this facility in better condition than we found it. So if you could please do your housekeeping at the end of the talk, we'd appreciate it. Secondly, I sort of lined up the speaker and so forth, but most of us didn't spend our careers in power engineering. So I was going to give a little bit of background here in case it isn't contained in the talk. So when you think about power generation or energy generation, in general, I mean, there's enough, and you think about your sophomore physics course maybe, there's enough energy generation, but it's just the time that when that needs to be generated and then consumed. And so due to that, there's a number of what are called peaking plants that exist around. And what those are designed to do is in a very low duty cycle, generate the power that's necessary for example, when you come home in the summer and you crank your air conditioner on, and then you usually hear this peak alert that says, please turn your air conditioner off and look for power consumption. These are when these peaking plants would typically come on. So that's the background. I think Jeremy will cover kind of where it is a little bit, but for those of you that don't know, this specific plant that he's going to address is out on West 14, about Highway 104. So a couple miles west out there, you'll see 5 sort of exhaust stacks up there. So that's where this specific plant is located. So our speaker tonight is Jeremy Sutton. Jeremy started his career in the Marine Corps. We thank him for his service there from 1995 to 2001. He was also a senior operator in Southern California near the Los Angeles area. From there, he came to join Rochester Public Utilities and was eventually promoted to chief system operator, and more recently is the director of power production at Rochester Public Utilities. So, and he has a BA in business management. So, Jeremy, if you could talk at yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me tonight. See if I can get this going first off. All right, well, I thought I'd start a little bit with our history. And hopefully there's no OSHA inspectors in here because they would just have a fit when I show this slide. But this is our original power plant in 1894, and this was southwest 3rd Street is where this came online in March 14th, 1894. So I just can't imagine working in these conditions. But that's when it came online, 1894. So RPU's been around for a while. There's an outside look of that plant, eventually that burned down in 1915 and was replaced with the North Broadway plant that still ran into the 80s. North Broadway plant was still going.
Question?
But
weren't there still AC versus DC wars going on at that time? I mean, Westinghouse versus Edison?
I think they were pretty well settled by that time. We were on an AC system. And a little bit about that North Broadway plant that was in there. We had an old guy from the Navy, he's since retired, but he had came in, it would have been in the early 80s, and they had him in that plant, and they said, okay, we're getting ready to start the boiler. And here's a pile of wood, go ahead and crawl into the boiler. And he said, well, I've been in the Navy, I know you're not going to fool me, I'm not crawling in, you're picking on the new guy. And sure enough, they're still even in the 80s, crawled into that boiler, had a load of pallet wood, and they started it by hand and got the fire going to start the boiler. So again, I'm glad I didn't have to work in those conditions. Here's a neat shot. This is our hydro facility, and this was being built. This was taken in March of 1919, and a lot of hand work you can see in that. And again, another slide that I'm glad I didn't have to build that. But very interesting. Here's another picture of the hydro being built. I'm sure we've all been out there on Lake Zumbro. Still a great facility. So built in 1919, and that thing is still running. We did a retrofit in 1984, rewound it, and we just did a lot of work in the last few years of putting a new roof and putting money into it. And it produces about $1 million a year for RPU and its citizens. So what an engineering feat. 1919. There's a picture around RPU in a couple of the offices showing some horses with plows getting the site prepped. Just amazing. And then here's Silver Lake being built, and I didn't get a date on this picture, but the first unit was built in 42, I believe. So it would have been around that time frame. And another picture of it, this was when unit 1 and 2, so it had 4 units, and this is an old picture of just units 1 and 2. And then fast forward to 2001, this is a Pratt Whitney TwinPack, and it's out on 7th Street. It's before West Side. This was our newest unit, like I said, built in 2001. This is what we call an aeroderivative unit. It's Pratt Whitney, go down the same line. There's 3 lines that they produce these engines, and they start off kind of all in the same one. One line curves left, and it goes to power production. One line stays straight, and that's the aerospace, and one line goes to the right and disappears forever, and that's the military version that you can't go past. There's another overview picture, and they call it a twin pack because there's 2 of those engines facing each other, and there's a generator in the middle that they spin. And then we also have another unit out there, and I joke around, I looked everywhere. For some reason, we didn't have cameras in the 70s or didn't take pictures. There's a Westinghouse unit out there that was, when installed, just on fuel oil. Now it's natural gas. And it was put in 78. And there's just a picture. I usually give this presentation outside of Rochester, so I just give an overview of Rochester. And then another view of the plant again. And this was before we put our emissions reduction project up. So you can see we're still have a coal yard. So this was pre-2010 time frame. And going back, I misspoke, 44, the construction started, but the units in that plant were 1948, 1953, 62, and 69. So the newest unit in this plant was in 1969. And we get a lot of talk. We were actually just talking before the climate that was in 2003. This is any speaker you'd go to would talk about a $6 MCF gas. And we were running out of natural gas, right? We didn't have enough. This was, again, in 2003. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina, and gas shot up. I think we saw gas at $20 an MCF. Again, so there's not a good supply of natural gas, so we thought coal was one of those sources in the mix. It was before, in 2003, there were a few wind turbines, but it was on nobody's mind. These were pet projects. They don't really provide enough to ever really think about, so coal was it. Coal was the predominant source. Natural gas was only used for peaking times. It was just too expensive. And then you had your nuclear facilities that were baseload as well. Well, so looking at those, we were also in this new thing called the MISO market. MISO is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. And what this did was gave Rochester an ability to go into a market-based system that let us throughout the whole Midwest compete on a level with all their generators. So if you went into the market and if your generator was priced appropriately, you would get picked up. The way I explained MISO to a lot of people is they are the air traffic controller for the power grid. So they tell you which plane can take off, just like an air traffic controller. They tell you which unit comes on, and there's a computer that solves every 5 minutes to say what is the cheapest generation mix that we can have at any given time. Yes, go ahead.
So you talked about the competition piece there. Given that there's a limited number of providers of the equipment that goes into a power station, all that stuff, how do you get competitive advantage? Is it efficiencies in operation? Is it really choosing which source of power you're using? What is the competitive component?
That's a good question. The competitive advantage really comes down to fuel source, your O&M. So there's all these things you can do there. So how you staff the plant, all those things go into the bid. And it's got to be within tolerance. So you can't just go in and say, I want $1,000 a megawatt. You have to prove, if I put $1,000 a megawatt, especially in our new plant, so that's a better way to put it, less moving pieces than in a coal plant. The market monitor knows what the fuel price is. They know about what your cost should be. And if you get outside of those bounds, you're flagged and you're a market manipulator. And you'll be answering to the feds. So in that case, with the coal plant, it was a lot more moving parts. So it's where you got your coal, what kind of train deals you get in, how much O&M is the plant? Have you had any major maintenance issues that are really driving up your O&M cost? So those were the market differentiator. That's a good question. And as that became unbalanced, it became harder and harder for coal to compete with natural gas. We'll get into that a little bit. So those were the things that we were looking at, and that's why, for all those reasons, we said, okay, this makes sense. So you're looking through the lens in 2003 that we're going to put better controls on this, better emissions controls on this plant. So we went in and we did a baghouse and a dry scrubber. And what that means is it takes out all the particulates, takes out all the bad stuff you can, that you can control on, oops. Well, that concludes my talk. Any questions? Not sure what happened. There we go. So we went through and did all that, and to the tune of about $40 million, we put the best available emissions control technology we could on the newest unit, our 60 megawatt unit that was built in 1969. Because of those factors, what we saw through our lens at that time, we're making a decision that we can't build a new plant to replace it for cheaper. And at the time, it was making money in the market. We could still get coal. And this, we did studies within the community that it was important that we clean up the facility, we clean up the air. It was starting to become important. So we did that. We made the decision to put that in, and the project was completed in 2009. It was a very successful project. Right up into 2010, we found out what an EPA 114 is. And so an EPA 114 that I become very knowledgeable with, or intimate with, was the EPA was, without getting political, they were exercising broad authority under these powers. They went through and they said that anytime you spent $100,000 in a power plant, you need to do a new source review. And I know you're not a lot of power plants, but you could pretty much trip over, sneeze, and you could spend $100,000. It doesn't take a lot in a power plant to spend $100,000. So they came knocking, and under the 114 powers, they haven't accused you of anything yet. They just want to see your records. And kind of the elephant in the room was that everybody knew that you've spent $100,000 in a power plant and you didn't go get a new source review. Granted, this was after we just put $40 million in this plant to put the best available controls on the one unit. So we did what everybody did. We went and got expensive lawyers, and we tried to fight this and say, okay, well, what do you actually want here? We know we're guilty. We're not going to say we're guilty. But you know that we're guilty under your new definition of this new source review. Let's just go right to the settlement period, or the settlement proceedings. We went back and forth a few times, and we were using consultants because they would put EPA would put something on the table, and we would go back and take a look at it. We looked at what it would take to switch all 3 units that didn't have the baghouse to natural gas. We looked at quite a few different avenues of approach to this to try to keep this plant open. We were really just under the lens of let's keep this plant open. It's been here forever. It's going to be here forever. This is what we're doing. Well, a lot of things changed during that time frame. Fracking started to happen. Again, well, nobody had heard of fracking. What was this? I just did a symposium, and a very expensive line of suits told me that you'd never see something less than $6 a gas. Now those same people are back up on the stage saying, you'll never see gas over $6 for the next 12 years. And it became very interesting. So I was down in Kansas City, and we're going back and forth, and we're working with Burns and McDonald. And I was in the room when my boss was there, the current director, the old director of power resources. And we were lucky enough to have an engineer in there that looked him square in the eye and said, you know, you're just being stubborn. You need to face facts that you need to shut this plant down. Well, I'll tell you what, that was a long ride back from Kansas City to Rochester of knowing that we were going to be the two idiots to shut down this plant that's been there forever. And we got to bring back this news. You know, looking in hindsight of where that plant's at, and I'll bring this up a little later in the speech, look how close we are to downtown. So it's kind of interesting that we were even, I think they'll look back and you look at that coal yard and that other slide and you look up, okay, well, look at where we're at. we're right by Mayo Clinic here where we're having this discussion. And we're trying to burn coal in downtown Rochester. Some of those things that going through it, you know, you get focused in on that we're keeping this open. But I think this picture really opens it up. We're trying to burn coal in downtown Rochester there. So it was interesting to take a step back and what are we really trying to do here? So we went right into the mode of, okay, now we've made the decision. We're shutting the plant down, which I must say that the plant is still going. We burned our last bit of coal in there in 2011. It'll never burn coal again. And likely that, let's use never, but it will never produce electricity under the steam turbines that are on the floor now. They are retired. But we have 2 units with natural gas that we're supplying steam to this campus. We have a steam contract to Mayo Clinic. So we went in and we looked at our projection. Okay, well, what's RPU look like without Silver Lake? And this is a balance of load and resources. Looking at our current, you forecast what we think the town of Rochester will use, and you go out to 30 years, and then say, okay, well, what are the gaps? How are we going to fill this in? What resources? So then you go in and you start filling those gaps in, and it's saying that if we run that dotted line is the system peak, and then you also you can't just supply to your peak. You got to have a little bit of reserve margin. So that's what the solid line is, and that's what you plan to. So we started throwing in some resources that would cover that peak, and it looks a lot better. You get a better mix of resources. You've got a little bit of, you go to the market, which I was saying that you buy from the market and you sell to the market. You can also go out and buy capacity from the market. So you got a little bit of everything. We put this plan together, they said in 2015, presented it to our utility board, and then told them also that, there's some things that we need to look out for. There's some potentials that are out there that could change our plan. Accelerated load growth in DMC, we still talk about that quite frequently. All these things that were on our radar. And then we put together this plan of what we were going to do. This is still our current plan. We have not done a new one. We anticipate doing a new one of these in 2019. And I assume that it'll look quite different than this plan. So in this one, we were looking at retire in that old Westinghouse that was built in the 70s. Put in a CHP possibly with Mayo Clinic. Again, that's just these are all just placeholders. A lot of wind. The significance of 2030, we're in a joint action agency with Southern Minnesota Municipal Power Agency. That contract ends in 2030, and we take over the majority of that. So that's why there's such a large unit put in 2031. And then all of these wind and solar placeholders that we have in here, those are just to meet the state mandate of 25% renewable by 2025. And I think kind of a neat thing that we have at RPU is we are carved out of that, being a municipal utility. We, by law, by the state statute of 216B, do not have to comply with that, but our leadership and our utility board has said, well, we're still going to comply with it. And then we probably all heard the mayor's proclamation of 100% renewable by 2030. So I think the 25% is probably the new baseline, and we'll be studying 100% renewable for our next infrastructure study. So going through this is what we presented to the board, that we have all these paths, and that we could potentially retire that and put a new unit in this time frame of 2019. We had a peaker unit in there from 2018, 19, or 2023, and different avenues and different approach. And then we chose number 4, that we would retire Cascade Creek 1, which is, again, that 1970s combustion turbine out at Cascade Creek, and put in a new peaker. So this just said that, yeah, we are going to put a new peaker in. And then we went through and studied, well, what resource do we want? We were pretty comfortable. We knew that it was aeroderivatives, the Pratt Whitney. Went through and did all the numbers, crunched them all, and saw exactly which one gave the best net present value. And that's how we chose those 5 by 9 megawatt recip engines. Some of the reason we showed in our original plan that that was supposed to come on later, but interest rates were so great. There was extra capacity in the area that you could purchase. However, it became tight, and it was, I kind of liken it to, I've always heard of farmers when Hormel would push down the price so low, there'd be a farmer that say, I'll let my pigs go before I sell them at that price. And there was almost kind of that market mentality of capacity. You're not just going to give away, if you have extra room on your unit, you're not just going to give it away, you're going to wait for the market to bounce back. So while there was some extra capacity out there, it became tougher to buy it, and people were wanting more than the auction was actually clearing. So some of the good things about this unit, and we'll go over these later on in this presentation, but you know, a low-cost, flexible, and environmentally compliant resource. So we're putting in a new resource. Our latest one was in 2001, and everything before that was quite a bit older. The technology had changed quite a bit. You're going to put in a unit with a much better heat rate, use a lot less gas. You're going to put in the best controls available today, so the emissions are going to be lower, less gas usage, and overall just a better resource that can go in. So we talked a little bit about what a peaking plant is, and it's not just for those hot days anymore. It's not just that day where the air conditioner comes on. We really come into, we have so much so many variable resources on the grid right now, with all the wind energy and the solar coming up. Solar not so much, it's just not as abundant, but there's quite a bit of wind out there. There's 16 gigawatts of wind in the MISO footprint. And as that wind comes on and off and fluctuates, it's these types of units that can be on in 6.5 minutes full load that fills in those gaps nicely. So a few more numbers. We anticipated or estimated $75 million project. When I first gave this, you know, we didn't include any finance costs in this, but I can say as we closed it out, we're probably looking at more of that $68 million. So that is quite a great feeling to stand in front of the board month after month and say, you know, here's my one slide, utility board. We're ahead of schedule and under budget. Any questions? and that is fantastic. The joke around the utility was that they gave a presentation to the utility board with 2 slides, and they had 1 slide too many. There was too many questions. So again, here's where it's at. It's 19th Street and 60th. And we had 3 sites that, or 3 locations that we thought we could put it on. I think looking back, it's interesting. You could see that ditch right there, what I would call a ditch, or sometimes even dry. That became an unnamed waterway to the DNR, so that became very interesting. We had to stay away from it. Here's a picture of a like unit. This is not our units, but the same type of unit in a facility. And then kind of a breakaway, and you can see some of the things in there. I'm sure we'll share the presentation, so if you want to look at these a little closer. It's basically a big diesel engine that runs on natural gas When we went out for bid, I expected that we'd have a backup fuel source and we'd run on some sort of fuel oil backup, just because that's what you do in the power industry. You have belt suspenders and you want to back up fuel for natural gas. It's not cost effective to get what they call firm gas. And the way that kind of works, right, talk about firm gas, it'd be like if you drive a trucking company to the cities from Rochester every day and you build your own 52 lane. And you pay for your own lane in 52, but you only use it 2 days a week. And that's how firm gas works. You would pay for all the upgrades, and then you would also pay to have that reservation. And it doesn't work in a facility like this that is a peaking facility. That you get firm gas for something like Mayo Clinic when you supply steam and you need it, and there's no tolerance for or appetite for risk that steam supply is not going to be there. It makes sense because you have a studied load. You know it's going to be 1,700 MCF a day. That's a good fit for firm gas. So here's one of the plants. We went around, we started visiting other plants to see lessons learned. It was kind of interesting. You know, one of the things is you always go and say, okay, get the business development guys out, get the managers out. I want to talk to the operator. And you'd ask the operator, okay, well, you know, what's the real deal here? What are they not telling us? You know, these guys are wanting to sell us these engines. What's really wrong with them? And without fail, every one of them told, like, some of them were pretty honest and said, you know, the biggest thing is I'm bored because they just run. So it was kind of nice to hear that. What we're looking at here are the stacks, and it's the same thing we have out at our facility. Is we have urea injection. So almost identical to what you'd have as a catalytic converter and a particulate capture for NOx is the same thing you'd have like on a diesel, where they have the Blue Def injection in a diesel truck. This is urea injection, and it runs through an SC, selective catalyst reduction, and scrubs out the NOx from the unit. Another kind of proud moment, we're sitting in there, and our emissions consultants were telling us we're right on the edge. We could probably do a study, and you might get away with not having these. And we said, no, it's one of our core values. We're committed to this, and we just put them in there. We never even did the study. We said we're gonna have this. Again, this is giving you a size and scope. This is one of the plants that we visited. And here was the timeline that we start in 2015, and we'll be done by May 1st, 2018. And we started that with the project planning is that May 1st, 2018, we had to be done. And that coincides with some of the rules within, again, the MISO market. Your capacity's got to be there and committed by May 1st to count for the year.
What was the brand of the generator again?
Scylla. It's a Finnish company. LLA. It's so when we were looking at all these engines, they're all European made. There was GE Inbacher, Caterpillar, which is made in Germany, I believe. They're all European manufacturers, and these are out of Finland. So go through these really quick, just some of the timeline stuff, and then we'll get into some of the specs of the engines in a short video. So in January, went through, got the RPU accepting our infrastructure plan, and then another engineering study for permitting and application, started to get some money committed to the project. August, we had the study results. They approved the project development with this last slide, the limited 453 powers, was very instrumental for the project. I don't know that it would affect too many people in here, but for us, we're trying to act and react as a business and do a project in the real time that it's moving fairly quickly. This was so great of our utility board to give us authority to act on kind of unilaterally, that here's the approved budget, and now you have the authority to execute it. And with this 453, we didn't have our hands tied as much as what you normally do in a municipal environment. So again, in December, staff development of the request for proposals, we started putting that together. And then we did EPC project, and then what was a little bit different, if anybody's familiar with the engineer procurement contract, we did an open book version of this, and this was really neat. I'd never done a project like this before, and it turned out very well. The open book portion, instead of being a turnkey EPC project where RPU would have really no involvement other than cutting the check, and then at the end of the project, they hand you the keys to the power plant. With this one, we were much more involved. We could look at each individual contract. We didn't get down into the weeds just for timing's sake, and we didn't want to be a burden to and hold the project back. But this gave us control over like HVAC type stuff. If we had something where, you know, local contractors were important to us, we could say that we know that this contract is $3,000 more, but we want this vendor to win. And we're willing to pay $3,000 more because we want a local contract. We just gave us a lot more control. Or if we wanted to use, say, a valve vendor that we were comfortable with and had spare parts and had good business relationship with, we had the freedom to do that as well. It just gives us a lot more input. So we put out the RFP, and in February the proposals were open. We approved the EPC, negotiated. And then we had our first kickoff meeting with RPU, and the awarded vendors was the Bolt Company and Sargent and Lundy. And they partnered on this, and they created a Westside Energy Partners. And it actually worked out very well again, because you had the construction company and the engineering company together that had a great partnership, and we all worked well together. And so here's a little bit about the word Scylla. Oh, I told you a lie. It's one L. Sorry. So there's the spelling of word Scylla. So we went with 5 of them, 20 cylinders, 13.4 inches on each cylinder, and spark ignited. Going back to that discussion on the fuel oil, one of the limitations on the fuel oil is when you lose your spark ignited, so you have to diesel ignite when you run fuel oil, and you got to run a 1% stream of fuel oil at all times. This becomes a hindrance on your air permit. It becomes very difficult when you're running fuel oil all the time on your run hours. It added quite a bit of cost structure to it on the engines, on the engineering and the physical asset. And so it became clear that it just was not going to happen. It was better off to just leave it as natural gas only. The risk to that and the downfall of that is natural gas. Like I said, we do not firm our gas. We do not have a firm gas supply to the site, so the gas company can cut us. So a lot of times in the middle of winter, especially when it gets, I'd probably say below about 15 degrees out, we lose our gas supply, or they cut it. They'll limit it, so say we'll have 6 hours of supply. And they were each 9.3 gross, so that it comes out to about a 46 megawatt plant. I think when we did the performance test, we got 46.5 net out of it. And then also we were up at the Capitol last week, and one of the I think it was Senator Sinjum asked me a question. He said, well, what's the horsepower? And I had to turn red-faced, and I couldn't do the calculation fast enough. And I said, well, it's like 1.3 to a kW or something, but it's wound up being about a little over 12,500 horsepower each engine. So then the next thing I had to look up. I was like, okay, well, what is that? You know, the only thing I can think of in that realm is a top fuel dragster. So a top fuel dragster is just funny that going on the track at 10,000 horsepower. There's a completed picture of the facility. What we're looking at there is on the left is the maintenance shop and the admin building. So we do have a few offices out there and then a maintenance shop. The radiators on the right-hand side there, that's how it's cooled. There's no cooling tower or cooling water. That retention pond is just for runoff out there. And some of the lessons learned, what this stands for is the MISO Generation Interconnect. And the Generation Interconnect is you have to get permission to interconnect to the grid from MISO. And we thought that this would be probably a 2-year process. We're operating now. We still don't have a signed Generation Interconnect. lot of problems with the way it happens. The issue really is that it's a complicated system. And there are a lot of wind generators that are interconnecting now to try to meet that. Every utility is trying to meet the 25% renewable by 2025. So there are a ton of third-party wind developers and independent wind developers that are trying to get into MISO and get their generation interconnect. So it comes back, whatever impact you have on the system as a whole, and I mean a whole, we could impact something in Kansas City, you have to pay for that upgrade. And it can be millions, it can be billions of dollars. So you do a lot of homework to say, okay, well, I don't think that, what we look at, that the little RPU with a 46 megawatt unit in the grand scheme of things can really cause too much damage to the system. But what they do is lump you together. So we were one of many units in a study cycle. And it's every time somebody drops out, they restudy and re-go through the entire process. So we're probably looking at January 2019 is the best guess right now for we'll have a signed generation interconnect. So we missed the mark on that a little bit. This doesn't mean that we can still operate. We're still in the system. It just means that we don't officially have an interconnect. We have what's called a provisional. So Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, another thing about the air permit. We thought we'd given ourselves another 2 years to get an air permit. We were wrong on that. In the end, I'll say right away, in the end, it worked out well. We got our air permit, but it was taking a lot longer. I think we were a little naive going into it, to be honest, that here we're putting a brand new plant in. It's got the best controls. It's burning natural gas. There shouldn't be a lot to do here. We thought we had our ace in our hand. What we thought was Shakopee, another utility, put in a very similar plant, and I mean almost identical facility up in Shakopee. So MPCA had just done a permit very similar. Well, nothing's easy. So it took a little bit of push to get that in on time. A couple calls to a couple of legislators to help push that along, to prod the process. Public input. This one really caught me personally, I guess, that we're putting in a facility. It's going to have some pretty darn good jobs associated with it, and we're in Rochester. It's not a loud unit. It's not anything noisy. I didn't think it was going to be controversial. Shame on me for thinking I knew what people were thinking. Lesson learned. There was a lot of public input. There was the people that came out and straight up that I can't believe you're putting an evil methane burning, child killing resource in. It caught me really off guard that there was that much public outcry, and I think it shows us that we have not done a good job as an industry as a whole, probably as RPU of putting out good educational points on how your energy is delivered. What it takes to live like we're living now, to live in a society that we're living now, that you need some of these resources. You need a resource that you can flip a switch and come on. So when you are expecting to live the life that you live, that you flip that switch, you go to Starbucks and the drive-through works, or you go to Caribou and that cup of coffee comes out, that you have to have these resources. There might be some day that you don't, but right now you do. Natural gas sourcing. We chose that site because there's a substation there of 161,000 kV lines. Then that's a perfect spot to put a resource, so you can get out onto the grid. And then also that's where the town border station is. So Northern Natural Gas Pipeline comes in on that property, and Minnesota Energy Resource takes over ownership of it right there. So it's a town border station. So it's absolutely perfect area. So the whole time that we thought we were so smart, we're right on the pipeline. We can bypass Minnesota Energy Resources. We'll hook right into that big pipe of natural gas, and we'll have gas all day long. Nope, we were wrong. We had a meeting with Northern Natural Gas, Minnesota Energy, and Northern Natural Gas came in the first 5 minutes and said, you do not want to hook into our pipeline. Here's the reason. You will be balancing on your own. So you have to tell us on a monthly basis, on a daily basis, exactly what you're going to use. And we sat there and we said, well, that doesn't work. We don't know when we'll be dispatched. We could be dispatched 5 times next week or none. We don't know. MISO is the one that dispatches us. So about 5 minutes said, yep, well, okay, you guys want to talk to Minnesota Energy Resources. So there's a reason that it's all built the way it is. And so we went through them. Again, lesson learned. It didn't no cost to us or anything. It was more of a procedural thing that you do need to go through a balancing agent to make it work correctly. And to that point as well, that just the gas supply. So another piece of it was a political piece of the natural gas supply. Minnesota Energy Resources was going for a rate study at the same time we're building our plant. They had nothing to do with each other. We were not the reason. Again, we're interruptible. We just take what's on the line. None of the upgrades done in town, that loop that they put in was a lot to do with the polar vortex and the growth that they foresee in the town in the future. You know, DMC coming, we want to get ahead of this. We want to have a robust gas system that can handle. They were on a ragged edge during that polar vortex. So all of that was done for that reason, but when a power plant comes online along with a rate increase, people correlated them and it didn't matter what the truth was. And we were kind of left in the wake explaining that no, there's no correlation there. But it was a bit of a black eye and a little bit of bad press. And I still get it today that you guys caused a rate increase at Merck. All the change orders were kind of eye-opening. I think that's in any project, but just going through all the change order process and how we did it. And there were some good things about how we did the project that right away, it was such an aggressive timeline. We tried to get this in 3 years, a very aggressive timeline. I think if I did another one, I'd want a 4-year timeline would be a much better project. We pushed our engineers pretty hard during this time frame. That we just didn't know that we're going to use that much internal labor to connect the system to our systems. And then just kind of talking through that from a project standpoint, that we pretty much used every resource within the utility. We were sucking up resources left and right at a furious pace. It probably wasn't too popular during some of this time frame. It took everybody. I mean, even, the water department with water side, which I don't work through too much. It was very interesting though to learn exactly what there's guys at RPU that have worked there for 30 years, and shame on me, I didn't really know what they did. I knew they were instrumental. I knew they were good people, but I didn't really know the process. I had no reason other than to have a coffee with them or something. But it was kind of neat to see people work their craft and do a good job. And this was some of the people that made that happen. And again, Sergeant Lundy. And then these were all I know we don't have them all, but just take a little minute to look through. And these were all the subcontractors that made it happen. We had a really great project management team from Bolt Company and Sergeant Lundy. But the gentleman with Bolt, Tony Densmore, did a great job. He was able to go through, and some of the stuff he did to kind of grease the skids at the forefront really helped the project. He was down here at the beginning before they even put a trailer in, meeting with some of the local union shops and getting a relationship with them. And I think that saved a lot of time on the back end of making things run smoothly. So when instances did happen, they already had a good working relationship. With that, I'll show you a little video, and then I'll take some questions. This is the last video we took. During the project, we had took some drone videos throughout the project, and this was the last one we did in November. So that's I forgot to mention that 60 kW of solar was put out there, and that's enough to cover the admin building. So there'd be a net zero user on the admin building. One of the things that's unique to our project, as you can see on the other side of the building there, that we put all of the lessons learned from Cascade Creek into kind of trying to weatherproof. So we put all the lube oil, all the urea storage tanks and all that inside. Got a lot of grief for it, but that was one of the things that myself and the plant manager kind of stood our ground on, that they will be inside. Everybody said, well, we'll put heat trace and everything, and said, no, absolutely not. It's heat trace will definitely fail, and it'll fail when it's 40 degrees out, and somebody's gonna have to be out there looking at heat trace. And it's I don't know how many times we've not been able to start a unit because of gelled up lube oil. So with that, take any questions?
Can you take a tour, or is it impossible to hear anything in the building when you're in there?
It is very noisy. So the question was, can you take a tour? We plan on having an open house in October, open to the public, and that'll be during Public Power Week. So I'll make sure that Dirk gets that word out that for everybody to come visit in October.
How did you decide on the 5 generators? You knew you wanted 46 megawatts, but you could have made it out of 2 megawatt Cummins. Why did you pick what you did? I'm not arguing it. I just wonder why you picked.
Yeah, so the question is, how did we end up with 5 Scylla engines versus anything else that was out there? We did a study on that to see what was the cheapest way to supply that, what our criteria was. We needed something under 50 megawatts. So our criteria really was like a 45 to 50 megawatt range. And this was the cheapest way to supply those. There's other variations. Scylla actually makes 18 megawatt units. And some of it's funny. It comes down to how you ship it here can mean a $2 million difference.
What is your load factor then?
So our capacity factor is around, we're looking at 20% is the estimate, and I think we might beat that. I think we'll probably be around 25, which is quite high for a unit like this.
25% load factor?
Capacity factor. So
what's the difference?
Capacity factor is if you take 8760, take nameplate of the unit times, so it's 46.5 megawatts times 8760, and then that's what you possibly could produce. And then we'll produce 20% of that.
So it'd be 20%. If you ran these things 24/7 all year long, you produce X, you produce it.
Be 20%. But how much does it vary is what I meant. How much does it vary? How much does your load vary?
Oh, on the unit, we control that.
I mean, for the city, for the draw on your. Do you hit 80% and then drop down to 20%? How wide a variation do you have on the power load?
Oh, so the question is
It's called the load factor.
Load factor. Okay, so we do, I think our lowest day, if we're going to get this right, Dirk might correct me right on the spot, I think we were 88 megawatt was our low. Does that sound right? And then we were all the way up to, and again, SIMPA's in there too, but around 300.
So you're supplying the electricity through SIMPA then?
SIMPA up to 216, they supply the majority of it.
Okay, then that organization that you use for distribution, is that just in the northern climate, or Texas has a different scheme, don't they?
Yeah, Texas, so it's split up, I believe you're referring to the different sections. So we have the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and then Texas. And for some reason, Texas split out on their own, and it's ERCOT, Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And so there's 3 different systems, and they're connected by DC ties, but they're all on their own AC system.
What level of control, so MISO does the dispatch. So what level of control do you have versus MISO? So in other words, do they dispatch a certain amount, a certain power, and then you decide how to spin that up, or do they control each engine?
No.
What's the split there?
We control it. The MISO actually, so we put a bid in, an hourly bid, and based on price or need for reliability, MISO tells you that, okay, well, you were cleared. So what'll happen is every day you put a bid in, MISO runs the model, and then they clear based on need for the whole system, MISO goes from Canada all the way down to Louisiana. So based on the need of the whole system, they start dispatching units based on price. So if where price meets that criteria, we'll run for 4 hours, and they'll tell us you need to be on at 46 megawatts starting at 07, and we want you on until noon, and then shut off. And then during that time, and that's called the day ahead, during that time, then they can reshuffle that as well.
Like how much can they reshuffle it?
Every 5 minutes they reshuffle. And so they can do that. And then with your offer parameters, you can really tighten that up and control. So right now we're having a little bit of an issue with urea flow with our permit level. We don't have continuous emissions monitoring. It's based on a calculation. So it says you have to be at 5.3 pounds of urea flow per hour. And we're actually doing better than that. We're controlling with less urea. So we need to block in and only run at full output until we get that situated. So what we can do is go in the market and say, no, we only offer it at full load at 46 megawatts. And so we control that factor.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. You don't do anything less than the 46 and a half.
We will once we get that straightened out, but some of the growing pains. This just went commercial at the beginning of the month. Yes, sir.
So you said they can cut off the gas. Will you know ahead of time? And how does that fit into the bids and so on?
Yep. So he's asking how we get cut off with gas. We get cut off. We'll get a notification usually the day before, sometimes 3 days before. If as soon as they feel that they being Northern Natural Gas, they have a 24-hour desk, 24/7 desk. They'll put out a notification that actually they call it. It's kind of funny. It's an SOL is what they issue, and you can imagine it stands for System Overrun Limit. And in that situation, they dictate that you're only going to have, say, 3,900 MCF of gas to burn because you're an interruptible customer. And so during that, and if you burn outside of that, there's penalties to be charged. So we'll put that in our bid price. Our units on 7th Street have backup fuel oil, so we'll switch those to fuel oil and price it accordingly. And the price goes way up on fuel oil, like a factor of 5. The other units, we'll limit it, and we'll say it's emergency only. So unless there's a full-blown emergency that this unit is only going to run for 4 hours, we'll pick those hours based on what we think are going to be the highest paying hours, and then go from there. We also have gotten situations that they'll get a call back and say, it's not a full-blown emergency, but if you can operate maybe another hour, we'd really like to see if you can do that. Our operators will call the gas company, and we'll work it out. And they'll say, yeah, we have gas available. Go ahead, and you've got another hour of gas to burn. If you don't, so the penalty, if say we can't go up, and so how the system penalizes you for not showing up is the capacity side of it. And I don't want to take too long. It's almost 8 o'clock. I'm going to keep you guys here all night, but you get hit on the capacity side of it. So I was showing that balance of load and resources. Before we ever produce a KWH, we have to prove that we have enough capacity to cover our peak load plus reserves. So you have to have on the books 315 megawatts, let's say for Rochester. Now, SIMPA provides most of that, and we're responsible for what's left on the top of it. But we got to show that we have that. You do that by either contracting out or you build. And or there's a third way, you could just buy it. So we've chosen to build it. So that we have 46 megawatts at this facility. Every time we have a forced outage, you get a little deduct on that 46 that you could apply to your load. So that's how you get penalized. So there's some repercussion for not showing up when you're supposed to, and being forced out and not being available. Yes?
Was this plant really built to service Rochester needs, or was it is there a different purpose for it? Because you're selling it on the grid, but I would think that because it's RPU and it's a public generation that'd be primarily built to satisfy our local needs?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's an interesting insight into it. So it was built purely to meet that capacity need. So when we look at how are we going to meet that 300 megawatt requirement plus reserves, so we have 315 that we got to.
Where's 300 megawatt come? Is that what?
That's our load. That's our peak load.
City
And
of Rochester.
we have to cover that.
For the city?
City of Rochester, so RPU is responsible for, let's say, 315. I don't remember what the exact number is, because the reserve margin changes every year. I think it's like 17% right now. So 300 megawatts is your peak load plus 17%, and you have to cover that. Now, we've contracted with Southern Municipal Power Agency, so they cover 216 of that equation, and then we have to cover it with our other units. And we went out and looked at it and said, okay, well, what's the cheapest way we can cover that? And what we found was this unit. This unit, at that time, when we did the infrastructure study in 2015, this was the cheapest way we could cover it. When we run in the market and make a margin on those hours, that just lowers the utility costs and helps pay for the plant. Does that answer the question?
Right, but it seems interesting. You're at 300. How long is it going to take when DMC finishes or gets going a little further? What's your peak load going to be in 10 years?
We think the latest one, and we go out to 2035. We'll go out to 2040 in our next infrastructure. We're constantly looking at where we think the load will be. And we also put in there as well as that some of the great things that they're doing with the demand side of the equation as well. So all the savings, and Dirk does a lot of this at RPU, all the rebates that we do, all the LED lighting have really made a difference.
So what does the peak rate look like in 20 years?
When we did the study in 2015, we thought we'd be at 400 megawatts, and I'm sure it'll be something less than that, unless we start adding electric cars and DMC really kicks up. But right now, to this date, in the last, I don't know what the time frame was, last 10 years, is that about right? We've saved a whole West Side plant. So because of our activities in what we call SIP, we've saved a West Side plant from being built by aggressive demand side management. So when we look at that and we go forward in the next infrastructure, the resource plan, that'll be a big piece of it. If we got more aggressive on the demand side of it, if we could go in and retrofit buildings and help control that equation or that side of the equation, will it be 400? I don't know. We'll have to pay somebody smarter than me to do that study. But it was 400 megawatts in 2030 when we did it in 2015.
I don't know, as a measure I've always thought of 65 megawatts was an oil refinery. So 300 for the cities, it's a lot of power.
Yep, it's a lot of power.
One more question, maybe?
And I'll say that's a lot of power before we ever plug a vehicle in. So we've got our eye on a lot of moving parts. Well, if no more questions, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you having me.